Check, check. Hey, it works. All right. Shorter, too. This is going to be hard. Because I don't want to be hunched over the whole time.
Just put it for your... Yeah, you're good.
So, I want to start with, did everybody have a good B-side so far? I know we're last. I know you're all tired. We're very appreciative for everybody who came out to listen to us wax poetic about SIEMs. So, let's jump right into what did the SIEMs see. Start with some introductions. JR, you can kick it off.
Hi, everybody. I'm JR Presmy. Currently, I'm a Splunk architect at the U.S. Census. I work for T-Rex. I'm also part of the Maryland Air National Guard. So when I'm not... that's one. So yeah, currently Maryland Air National Guard. So when I'm not doing stuff with Splunk over at Census, I'm doing more Splunk stuff over with the Air Force. I've been using SIEMs for quite a while. If anyone remembers Cisco Mars, yes, I used it.
I don't.
I've configured it. It sucked. It's end of life. I'm also a pretty avid golfer. Actually, just a couple weeks ago, I got caught by my CISO during lunch. It was a nice day. Went, hit the driving range, came back, had my glove on still. He's also an avid golfer. He was kind of mad I didn't invite him. So, and that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. And I'm Shawn, or Understudy. I am a paranoid and the head of security operations at Verizon Media. I was a breach consultant. I ran some managed services for a while. I'm a general SIEM user and program builder. My job and what I'm going to be talking about throughout the course of this talk is the how do we use this to find bad guys. That's really what I'm here for. He's way smarter than me. I also really, really suck at Twitter. I am trying to get better, though. But that's enough about us. So if we kick right into it, let's start. JR, what is a SIEM anyway?
Well, what a SIEM is, Security Information and Event Management System. The SIEM gives you different functionalities. One big thing is log retention. It's a good place to store all your logs into the SIEM. And then once you have all your logs in that one location, you can also do correlated searches across different data sets with your SIEM. Then you can...
So hold on, because I want to make sure I get this right, because I thought it was a thing that pissed off security analysts regularly.
Well, that's later on when we talk about alert fatigue, but we're not there yet.
Okay.
But yes, they do piss off security analysts, because SIEMs also give you alerts, and when alerts fire off, analysts need to do something.
Now, there's a lot of different kinds of SIEMs too, right? Just about everybody's kind of in this game. We want to go through some of that.
Yeah, there's plenty of different SIEMs out there. The Elk Stack's a popular one. I'm in a Splunk shop currently.
Also in a Splunk shop.
But this is not a Splunk talk.
It's not.
We promise.
Ignore my Splunk cup.
But yes, there's also another great thing you can do with SIEMs is getting dashboards and visualizations. Now, yes, most of us here can go on the system, grep, and find anomalies in the logs, which is fine, but that doesn't scale. You're not going to do that across an enterprise. So you need a SIEM to have a single place to kind of look for everything and find what's not normal, find your anomalies using your SIEM.
So, fun fact, I did actually spend about 6 months as an engineer, much like you, and I found out two things. One, I'm not very good at it, and two, I hated it. So I quit doing that, and I started doing other stuff that was way more interesting. But I very much rely on guys like JR to make the guys that I work with better and able to do their job. So, as we kind of walk into this talk, one of the most important things to start with is the importance of knowing your use case with a SIEM. That becomes so important because that use case really says how you're going to configure it, how you're going to set it up, what you're going to look for, all of that. So let's go through some of those.
Yeah, so the main driver of SIEMs in the space now is compliance. It's the you shall to be compliant. With your compliance, you'll have your audits, your periodic review to make sure you're staying compliant. And those are that's one of the biggest drivers of SIEMs you're seeing in the market. And when SIEMs are built to those standards, sometimes they do end up with issues. So compliance SIEMs, when I go to a customer site, I can quickly tell that this SIEM was built strictly just for compliance because it is a check-the-box SIEM. and they can't really hunt or find anything in it. It's just, you see what they need to have as far as, yes, we have these types of logs, there's some dashboards, and there's nothing else.
Next we have
security operations, pissing off your analysts. Send lots of alerts to keep the analysts busy. But that's not actually what the point of a SIEM for security operations. It's to bolster the security posture of your operation.
I click too fast. I do feel like I'm on a bit of a power trip with the clicker, like I'm swinging every time. Threat hunting.
And now threat hunting. Now an actual usable SIEM. We can actually find bad guys and protect your network and look for notables and
so that, because we're come from Splunk Shop, a notable is essentially a security event in everything else. So if we say notable, sorry we screwed up because we're trying to be not specific, but what it means is a security alert or event. For anybody not familiar with the Splunk side.
Right.
And incident response.
And then last but not least is incident response with your SIEM. Therefore, as long as you have the logs, if you can, afford to keep those logs for a length of time, incident response can come in and figure out what happened. And there you go.
So now that we've gone through some of that, really the first thing that you do, you pick your product, you figured out what you want to do, you know your use case. First thing you have to do is say, what is coming in? What are we going to do with this? And that's our log source problem. First one we really talk about here, we go back to compliance because it's such a prevalent use case.
Yeah, so your compliance-driven SIEMs, they tell you what to put into your SIEM, how long to keep it, and those drive your requirements. Other things that can drive your requirements is your customers and their use cases. Well, they'll drive your requirements of how you design your solution.
Any specifics, examples or thoughts or things that people might want to come at if we're compliance, what do we have to log?
Yeah, you typically want to look at security relevant events, firewall logs, after hours logins, all logins, admin usage in your SIEM, proxy logs. I mean, there's a gamut of things that needs to be inside of a SIEM for an effective hunt.
And it ultimately depends, PCI, HIPAA, what you're looking at depends on what you need to log. This, however, is not a compliance talk because we want to keep everybody awake. So we're not going to go too far into that. Next, we come into the intense importance of knowing your environment. What tools do you have and what do you use? What's your detection suite and package look like? Is that going into your SIEM? Why or why not? And we're going to talk a lot more about that later. What's your server and endpoint deployment? Are you primarily Mac, Windows? What do you have from syslog servers or OS query? And then what are your crown jewels? And this is a really important one that a lot of people don't do. Threat modeling across crown jewels and just identifying their most important company assets in the first place. Because if you're not logging your most important company assets, then you're not going to know when you're losing a bunch of money because they just got taken down or breached. And you define your detection strategy, which we'll also talk about quite a bit later. So are you going to go right out of the box? Splunk has Splunk Security Essentials. QRadar has their own. Nitro has their own. They all do. You can turn them on, you can tune them, you can play with them. Most of the shops that I've been at prior didn't really understand what they were looking for and just kind of turned them on, and we'll get to that. Are you going to use a framework? We're only going to talk about one framework today, and that's ATT&CK. So if anybody's not familiar with ATT&CK, you should be. It's by MITRE. It's great. That guy works with them. Fantastic. But I don't really think there's another one worth talking about, so that's the only one we're going to talk about. Or are you going to take a hybrid approach? And I feel like that one we're going to cover a whole lot. But first, let's go through kind of defining the strategy, and let's use MITRE as an example, because that's really interesting and a little bit overwhelming, right? So that is MITRE ATT&CK in a nutshell. And I'm not going to go into each individual piece of that or through all of that.
He asked Joe for that.
Yeah, there's our nutshell. If I'm trying to figure out detections across this, and not even detections, but I'm trying to figure out what log sources I want, that's overwhelming as hell to look at. But there's kind of a saving grace to this. Pardon the dad joke pun, too. As overwhelming as it may be, NetFlow traffic alone can net you a bunch of different stuff across MITRE. So it's all about understanding your log sources and then knowing what you can get from them. And that becomes the important part of scoping. So you're not looking at this and saying, oh, I need all this stuff. You're looking at this and saying, oh, this log source that I brought in can cover these things. But perhaps you're a new shop and you want to be a little bit more specific. Is anybody familiar with this report? This is Red Canary's 2019 threat report. Fantastic report. They basically took all the attacker stuff that they have and they said, this is how attackers attack. If you're building out for operations, detection, or hunting, this is a really great thing to have because you can say, hey, attackers are attacking us this way. Am I looking at that? Am I logging that? Do I really know what that means? And as a nice little cheat sheet, we've included some things in there. Different event IDs, different things that you can monitor and pull in that can kind of help you throughout that process. So I'll leave that up for a minute just in case, and we can probably try to make the slides public.
So you're saying if you're not logging PowerShell, you're failing?
Realistically, at this point, if you're not logging PowerShell, you're probably failing. If you want to find bad guys, and I want to find bad guys. That's my thing. So I would strongly suggest that. Because a lot of this other stuff, so Mimikatz down there, most of the time now it runs in PowerShell. So you log PowerShell, you get Mimikatz. You get a lot of stuff when you run PowerShell. It's fantastic. So we're going to step away from this for a little bit, and we're going to come back to it later with a use case as we talk about detection strategy. And we're going to move on to the importance of data throughput. And for that, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. So more logs does not equal better SIEM. That is not how you measure the effectiveness of a SIEM. You got to be selective for what kind of gets into your SIEM. I've been to customers where I see them ingesting tons of VoIP logs. I don't know why. They have VoIP logs. They're also ingesting block teardown packets. Doesn't give you any information.
There is a caveat to this, though. And that caveat all depends on your use case. Because, and I'm sure everybody here, especially if they're in blue team, has heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out. Not true. The goal of the SIEM is to take garbage in and make value out. That's what it's there for. If I ingest all telemetry data from command line interface, I'm not going to get a lot of value just from that. If I pair that with a pretty lively amount of threat intel or a bunch of other stuff, all of a sudden that becomes incredibly valuable because I've got command line interface talking to a known threat actor that I'm tracking. So you could say that that's garbage in, value out, which, not saying pipe everything into your SIEM because one, it's expensive, and two, it's not realistic. But know what you want and don't just assume like, oh, well, I can't alert just off this, so I don't want it. Anyway, sorry, continue.
And also, when you understand what's going into your SIEM, understand the path, understand where your syslog servers are, what firewalls are between them. If you have S3 buckets, understand those security groups that go into those S3 buckets. If anything changes that can prevent that data from flowing, that needs to be treated as a security incident. These things should not be tampered with.
You're still up.
Oh, and also integrate with all your security tools. Your security tools need to play nicely. So if you have an AV solution, the AV solution should not be scanning the data in your syslog index. You don't want that's just going to hurt performance, and it's just a waste of a resource. So don't do it. Have your security tools all play nice together. If you have firepower, if you're using different tools managing REST APIs, if you can have some automated actions where your SIEM can actually block things, have them work together within the SIEM.
Now for your dad joke.
Oh, and event time. This is kind of one of my pet peeves. Yes, I know we're on the East Coast and we think the world revolves around our time, but when you're logging, these are your 3 time choices, and actually they're all at the same time. So yes, use a standard timing format to ingest your logs. Once it gets to your site, then you can always convert it to your Eastern time to keep your analysts happy. But they need to come in the right way from the beginning.
You want to tee up the next one?
Okay, so now tell me about retention. Actually, retention.
Yeah, this is yours.
Yeah, so data storage and retention. So you got to understand those requirements for data storage and retention. I remember we were at one customer, and they currently had about 6 months worth of storage logs. And then one of their security leads told me that according to the STIG that they read, they're supposed to have 5 years worth of logs. And I explained to him, you barely have 5 months. Instead of arguing over this, I said, give me some time. I'll try to figure out a solution. And then I priced out a 7-figure solution that could hold 5 years worth of data logs. and that was queryable. That conversation never got brought up again. So
Moving on.
Moving on. Also, data protection, data resiliency. Now, you can't encrypt everything. Typical syslog of UDP port 514 is not going to be encrypted. You have to understand that. But once it hits your syslog server, you can encrypt that data. And then data should be encrypted at rest for your SIEM. And also data resiliency. You have a SIEM. It's an integral part of your security process. Don't have your SIEM in one rack. So when we lose power in that one building, you have no SIEM. I've seen this before. It sucks. Don't do it. And also ensure your solution can scale. Year after year, you're going to get more data. Your data's not going to go down. It's going to go up. Yes, Splunk loves this and other vendors, but this is the reality of the situation. And sometimes you have to scale out, sometimes you have to scale up and just add more devices, or maybe just add more storage or more capacity to the existing infrastructure.
So what's your recommendation on that? Because there's a lot of differences between scale up and scale out. So like, what's your approach? How would you go about that?
I typically like going to scale out because you scale out gives you the data resiliency and through your load balancing and better performance. I typically, if you can afford it, I'll go for scaling out.
The other upside of that is it kind of hits some of bullet point number 2. You get a little bit of resiliency when you scale out. And lastly for this one.
All right, so now we're going to talk about understanding your logging requirements.
Fast story.
Oh yeah, fast story. All right, yeah. So fast.
It's not his first time up here.
No, talking about storage. Now, if you have this data, you have all your alerts, you have your rules, you have correlations. But if you don't have the IOPS to actually search the data, how useful is it? Many times I've been with customers, and a main thing that I've been told is, "Hey, don't worry, storage is cheap. We can buy more." You don't need storage. You need IOPS. Data in your SIEM, you take a tiered storage approach to it. Most current data needs to be on your best performing storage. Then your second tier data for things that's been a little bit older and things that you really don't care about, stick it in Glacier or put it in a vault somewhere. It's not going to get stored. But you have to look at that tiered approach. But things that's going to be queried consistently needs to perform.
So there's a little bit more to this line, actually, too, than just how fast your storage is. And that's how good are your analysts at pulling up the data, and what does our architecture look like? I've been in situations where an analyst would try to look for something over an hour, and it would take 2 hours to run. Not particularly efficient, especially if you want to run that relatively regularly, right? 1 hour turns into a 2-hour search. Now I have data. Now I do it again. Just doesn't work great. But now as we're starting to move into some of the analyst problems. So let's keep going down that path. So alerting, seeing the bad guys. I like seeing bad guys. I think that's great. What can keep you from seeing bad guys? Lack of visibility. If we don't have it, we can't alert on it. I'll tell an old IR story that I think is really relevant to this case. So we went on a case for a customer who had a server that was hacked. We were trying to find the entry point of said server. We strongly believe, very specifically where that entry point is still, was on a thin client network. And they went from there and then pivoted into the server environment. However, they had 0 logging on their thin client environment. And if anybody's familiar with thin clients, once you restart them, it blows everything away. So if you're not sending anything out, you got nothing. And they had nothing. So we can strongly believe that, and we made the strong recommendation that they start logging it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to have that visibility into the things that you want. You can't alert on it, and a lot of times you can't get some of the contextual information. So lack of context. It's a really big one. If I'm monitoring a bunch of threat indicators, and I'm worried specifically about APT-targeted threat indicators, and I'll use this example probably a couple times because it's a really easy example to use, and I'm lazy. And I'm getting hits from DNS, but I have no necessary link or DNS logging to tell me where it's going to. I have no other necessary network logs to tell me where it's going to, or what generated that alert, or what generated that connection. What value is that to me? I can't track that down. So it could be bad. could be not bad, but I can't really do anything about it. And that doesn't help me as an analyst to find bad guys. So having that context and having that ability to dig a little bit deeper, some redundant log sources, covering multiple parts of network, etc., tend to be really beneficial in this use case. Next, we go into non-actionable alerting. Does anybody, just out of curiosity, anybody here like work in a SOC type environment? Couple. So, anybody deal with non-actionable alerting? Stuff that comes in and you can't do anything about it? Couple. So, what's your group's mission? What are you there for? I work at a place that has multiple programs, so we have different missions and different actions. So, you know, we might have an alert that says disabled user account attempting login. That's great. I don't care. Maybe Insider Threat cares, but I don't. I don't want that in my queue. Or we might have, you know, potential brute force, and we got to be real picky because if it's 100, I don't care. What can I do about it? Nobody got access. They haven't gotten in. It doesn't matter to me. And I don't want to burn cycles on my people going, I can't really do anything. Like, I looked into it, but there's nothing I can do. Not really a good use of resources. So next, as we move into that, we move into probably the big one for everybody involved in this, and that's alert fatigue. Alert fatigue is a bitch. The whole concept of alert fatigue, for anybody who's not familiar, is this process that I've looked at this type of thing over and over again, and every time it was this. So every time going forward, it's going to be this. It basically removes the part in our brain that goes, this is interesting, and goes, I'm bored, it's nothing, move on. It's a pain, and it's a very, very real thing in most operations settings. So how do you kind of fix that? And that's not always on the analyst. That often stems on content. And if a content team doesn't have a good relationship with your analyst team, you're probably screwed. Because I use a formula, and this is my thing. Take it if you want. Intent, fidelity, and frequency. Because everybody talks about fidelity. I want the highest fidelity alerts in the world. I don't give a shit about just fidelity. I really don't. Fidelity is great, but if everything that I had was 100% true positive, I don't really need an analyst at that point. I'm done. I know it. I don't need that person to make the distinction. And an analyst's role really is to say, hey, I have determined that this is bad, or I have determined that this is not. That's the job. So you take a couple things into consideration instead of just one. You take intent. So intent is, what is this thing looking for? What does this mean? What is the possibility that this is going to be particularly bad? And if it's a true positive, how bad is that bad going to be? So is this a breach? Is this denial of service? Or is this, just somebody was, web application pen testing and we blocked it? So that's where intent comes in. Fidelity, I think everybody knows, likelihood of true positive to false positive. And then frequency. And frequency doesn't get talked about a lot. But frequency is a really interesting one because if I have something that has a very high intent, and for the record, frequency is how often does this fire on a regular basis. So if I have something that says, if this fires and it's bad, it's a breach, which is a big deal. And it fires once a day to once every couple days, but most of the time it's false positive. Maybe it's a command line argument or something that sometimes happens in the company, but I can't tune it because you can't tune everything. You should be able to tune everything, but you can't tune everything. Maybe I want to keep that there because it doesn't come in a whole lot. It's relatively easy to verify and we can move on. And as we kind of talk later about moving past the basics, we can talk about some ways to fix that. But for now, that's where it is. The one thing that didn't make it to this deck, I realized, was tuning, and more tuning. And this concept of the constant back and forth in a SIEM from an alerting perspective, where you have to be on top of it. So you have to have processes to tune out intel if you're tracking intel. You have to have processes to tune out alerts. You have to have processes to say, I have determined this is false positive. I have determined that I can always say this is false positive based on these specific considerations. I never want to see this again. I want it gone. You got to be able to do that. It's like blowing something away. It's fantastic.
And also with tuning, you need to remember, when your environment changes, your SIEM has to change with it. When things are updated, you need to understand that. If you're in the SIEM game, you're in the CCB or your CAB change boards. You need to understand what's changing that environment so you can properly log that environment.
So then, throughout that, we kind of come into this concept of knowing what you're looking for. And that becomes a very important part of this, because if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it. I'm going to talk specifically about a type of alerting strategy called hybrid alerting strategy. Sounds fancy. It's really not. What that means is we're taking a bunch of tools. We're taking IDS, we're taking EDR, anything that we can, we're sending that into our SIEM. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why we might want to say, so we have CrowdStrike. I'll use CrowdStrike because the use case is using CrowdStrike. There's a bunch of reasons that we might want to take all of our CrowdStrike telemetry data and alerting and put it into our SIEM. So if our SIEM is our single pane of glass for alerting and we have a great tool that has great alerts from an endpoint perspective, I want those alerts to come into the channel that my people work out of. I don't want to put them in 2 panes of glass. 2 panes of glass means that there's less of a response time. That's not great. So the more you can get into one place, the better. More importantly, having all the additional telemetry data and logging that a tool like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black can do adds some other interesting benefits that we'll get to in a little bit. Secondly, Intel. Whatever you use, be it free, be it paid, be it through a threat intelligence platform, be it not, Intel is valuable. Intel does a good job of filling gaps in a non-specific way. With Intel, I don't need to know how the attacker is coming. I just need to know what he uses. What's his domain set? What's the IP set? And Intel changes a lot, and also, much like any alert, needs to be constantly tuned. But Intel can give you visibility into things that you would never have visibility into. Because if you look at something like MITRE, attack, specifically, you can make use cases out of quite a bit of that from an alerting perspective, but it will take a long time, because I don't know how many people have alert, like the guys who generate alerts. There are usually not that many of them, and they're usually way overworked and helping out a lot of people. So Intel can fill in those gaps. Plus, I can't make an alert off every piece of attack. It would never work. There's too many things that are too close to normal user behavior that you just can't do it. So we add our Intel piece in. So now we're logging Intel as a feed. We're logging our tool sets, our IDS, all those alerting as a feed. And now we're going to start to try to fill in some gaps with attack. So we're going to pick a framework, and we're going to use that framework, and we're going to look at it from that perspective. Before I go into the use case, you want to say anything about this? I also need a drink.
Oh, no, about well, using MITRE is basically a standard. There are other frameworks to use, but most people use MITRE for that reason. It's most complete. It covers most of the use cases.
I am strongly of the opinion that none of the other ones matter now that attack exists, because it's easily the most comprehensive. And it's basically what everybody is using, so standardization is good. And we as an industry really suck at standardization, but we should be better at it, because then we can kind of be like, oh, how did you find this thing, and how does that look? And we can talk to each other and present ideas in a way that's like, oh, I could totally implement that exactly like this. It's great. So, we good for the use case? So let's kind of do a use case. And I'm not going to lie, let me prep this a little bit. I stole this use case bold-faced right from MITRE. And I did it for a very specific reason, because one of these sections is talking about tool detections and what tools can see. And MITRE's testing tools. And I didn't really want to go through the pain and suffering of trying to test some of these more expensive tools and be like, what will detect where? MITRE's already doing it. I'll use theirs. So we're going to use their APT3 emulation plan. And I stole this right from their website. There's a link to the report there if you want to go through it. So you can take a look. So they set up their C2s. They set up all their software packing, compromising hosts, defense evasion. They did a lot of stuff. I'm not going to go super into detail on the technical side of just this. But I will tell you that this is what they were testing for. So out of that big list that I showed earlier, this is specifically what they were looking for. So it's a relatively small subset. They already did the work for me from the tool perspective. So I use CrowdStrike as an example. If I have CrowdStrike, that's what we had an alert on. Now, it's important to say before somebody goes, oh, that's not much, because that's not necessarily true. This is what we had a specific generated alert on in near real time. That does not include detections via telemetry data or detections from the Overwatch team that was also involved in this study. And I just want to throw out this disclaimer because it's important, and I have no problem with the product, but it's important to note that. We'll talk about the importance of some of that other data a little bit later, but for now, this is what generated an alert. So if I'm piping alerts directly into my SIEM, I would have been alerted at these stages. I can map that. I can know that. I can know exactly where I am. So now we have a bunch of intel. I stole this from a 2014 threat report on APT3 from FireEye. They have a bunch of information on APT3, and there's a bunch of open source intel and normal intel on it in general. So if I'm looking for this specific attacker group, I've got some things that I can look for. I can look for IPs, I can look for domains, I can look for hashes, if I have the ability to look for hashes. I can do that with CrowdStrike, I can do that with OS Query, I can do that with any Windows, Sysmon. So I have a lot of ability to kind of use some of this to go, well, I don't have a specific detection for this, but I can find it like this, which is great. So how does Intel fit? So Intel kind of doesn't map to a specific piece, and that's okay. Intel kind of fits over top. So Intel is going to be a little bit more kill chain detection. We're going to be looking at execution. We're going to be looking at command and control and exfiltration and those items. So Intel fits a little bit more kind of over top because it's broad, and at any point that we see that indicator, we're going to see it. We go from there into, hey, this is what we detected. We detected throughout here. So what kind of gaps might we have? What didn't we see? Could we have caught this earlier? Could we have caught this different? Because a lot of attackers are going to probably attack just like APT3 did. And a lot of the same techniques happen. They get repeated. They get reused. So the intel helps us with APT3 specifically. CrowdStrike, we're testing them. They have good detections. They're finding stuff. But they might not find everything. So what are our gaps? So this is by no means an all-inclusive list. Not even a little bit. This is just some of the things kind of off the top of my head that I was like, oh, we could probably potentially try to build some use cases off this. And some of them are kind of specific. I don't know how hard this is for everybody to read. It's very hard for me to read right now. So command line interface. Command line interface might not be one of those things that we talked about this, but it might not be one of those things that we can say, oh yeah, we can do this. But we can look for certain operators. We can look for like no exec on PowerShell. We can tie it to Intel and see if there's any Intel hits. So there's a lot of very specific things. And when you start to alert on these, you get specific. So I can tell you that per technique, it's not uncommon for me to have made or seen about 6 to 10 individual use cases per technique that we're hitting down the line. That's how you're going to get your visibility, because you're going to need different things for different log sources and then different things for different things. Detecting PowerShell is PowerShell. Now I need 15 ways to find bad PowerShell. So we color in a little bit, and we see that we now have the ability to fill in a lot of this stuff. And this is also where you find one of the one things about attack. You're not always going to find everything. I challenge anybody, and if I very well could be wrong. I'm not an expert by any means. I would love to see somebody make good detections for discovery. That's pretty normal. Like, moving through folders. I'm looking at you, Joe. We're going to talk about this now. You made a face. It's normal user activity for the most part. It might not be a bad hunt, but it's not a great detection. Unless you're very, very specific in what you're looking for, which you have to address from a risk perspective at that point. I'm very, very specific here. There's a really good thread on Twitter before I came here, actually, about this same thing. Use attack, no attack, but understand the limitations. Don't just color it in because you have one rule, because that doesn't mean you're protected. There's a lot of things that come into consideration. We tend to pick a technique, stick with that technique until we've mapped every possible thing we can think of for that technique, and then move on to the next one. And then we're going to have to go back when we're done and readdress all of them because everything will have changed. Because, yay, we love this. So we'll move away from this use case for a minute here, and we'll move into a little bit on the hunting and IR side, which, oddly enough, is not a whole hell of a lot different than what you need. Some of the problems that keep you from finding the bad guys there, data retention. We talked a little bit about, not logging stuff, but data retention is a big one here. Because most breaches, what's the current data? I haven't been an IR consultant in a little while, but a year and a half? Is it a year and a half? We find people after a year and a half? If a good attacker's in a system? I feel like that's right, but yeah, I feel like that's right, but please don't quote me. But it's astronomical. So if we're at a year or even a half a year, what happens if we don't have data and we detected the tail end of a breach? How do we find out what they did? So if you're worried about that, hope that you're logging stuff on the things that are important to you, at least. Searching through big data. We could do a whole talk on searching through big data, so we're going to glance off of it in like a minute. Making sure that it's indexed and parsing so that you can search and you have specific fields. And using every training resource humanly possible to learn the tool and its specific query language. And I'm sure you have something to say here.
Definitely with your queries. Practice your tool. Know your tools. Be efficient with your query language. Don't search every index. Don't search all time for everything.
You mean I can't just do star index equals star?
No.
I want my lobster.
You're not doing star equals star. And don't run everything in real time. You don't need everything in real time.
I genuinely suggest not to run anything in real time. If you're searching, you're looking for something that happened in the past, therefore you don't really need real time. That's from purely a searching perspective. But this isn't alerting. This is searching. This is looking through old data, right? Anything else you want to add there?
No, that's it.
All right, so here's the big one. So we talked a bit about lack of visibility from like a SOC and alerting perspective. Oh my God, hunting and IR people need way more. All the visibility. So important because every little tiny detail, every bit of command line interface, every service that was created, every process that started, every network connection that ever happened becomes so important in a breach situation. Because in a breach situation, you essentially have a couple goals. What happened and what did they do? You need everything to figure that out. And you pull on the weirdest of threads, like just the absolute weirdest of threads going through this. You could be anywhere from email to network traffic to endpoint. You want it all. It's a big deal in that. Same thing with hunting. I mean, hunting is essentially alerting without alerting. It's going through a huge minutia of data. Everybody talks about hunting like it's so sexy, right? It's really not. It's basically going, let me look at every executable that exists on a system, and let me see if any of them stand out. Or, oh, let's look at every instance where a command line was run and see if anything's weird. And you get a little bit better at it. Let me see, every child process pair and any weird ones. Or let me look at every executable under 7,000 bytes. Like, it gets to that point. Like, it's very tedious work, but it's very exciting when you find stuff, and that's why everybody loves it.
It's definitely great when you find stuff. Because I did some hunting of a client, and we assumed that since we had McAfee on our systems, that no one was burning removable media that wasn't supposed to. And I couldn't get logs from McAfee, and so they said that we're good on this in this point. But we did have Sysmon data, so I simply just launched Sysmon on the system that I knew had burners, so I was not running it on any of my thin clients. And then I made a list of everyone who's burnt and everyone who's authorized to burn. Took that delta with a simple with a simple Python script in this instance, and then reported quite a few people burning that weren't supposed to. The McAfee folks were thrilled.
So, as we talk about this, let's kind of go back to this again. This is exactly the same one that was there before, but now the SOC has kind of evaluated this situation, and they've determined that, command line interface, new, scheduled tasks, those aren't really things that we can find a way to make a decent alert off of. It's just not something we can do. They are great hunts, though. Wonderful data to have for a hunt. If I'm hunting, I want to look at every scheduled task. I want to look through command line. I want to look at every new service, although you could potentially make a case to make that an alert, depending on where you are. And more than just from the hunt perspective, as great of hunts as these make, you better have them if it's an IR. If you're in a breach situation, this stuff becomes intensely more valuable. One thing that I do want to cover on hunt about this, though, is say my hunt team or my guys who are hunting are going through all scheduled tasks or all command line. They're going to take that analytic and in general hunting, they're not just going to poke in the dark, they're going to refine it. They're going to say, okay, determine this false positive, remove this. And they're going to try to pare that down to as small of a piece of data as they possibly can. When they do that, they're going to make a determination that, oh, maybe at the end of this hunt, this analytic could be useful for the SOC. So it's very important to have a general, like, between SOC and between hunt, if those are two separate teams, to have conversations between them, because some of those analytics that they're doing, they might be able to pare down enough looking through this huge minutia of data to turn it into a very valuable alert. And then, I swear, this is the last time. I just wanted to give a general example outside of just the use case of some things that might be beneficial for hunting. Because I know CrowdStrike detected PowerShell, but it might not detect every bad piece of PowerShell. So PowerShell makes a pretty good hunt. So just kind of a thing about some other things that you could hunt that could be very useful. And lastly, another thing that I have found very useful throughout my career, and I've kept this up for a very long time, is a list of really cool windows of NIDs for hunting and alerting purposes. I've got about a 3-page list. I've pared this down to about 20 that I think are relatively important and relatively easy to implement and manage. PowerShell's in there, any clearing of auditor security logs, RDP connections and terminal services, different account creation and password reset stuff. Those all become very beneficial when you're working through a breach or IR, which is when I used to use this data, or even as building out a detection and alerting strategy. So, we've done all this stuff. We've got this stuff built. How do we move past those basics? What comes next in the world of all of this? And as a general person who doesn't actually like this one very much, I'm going to let him talk about it first.
Well, yes. And in our world, you need to look at to automate some of the routine processes, your maintenance, your patching of these systems. The role of your SIEM is to support your SOC, support your analysts. And if you're spending lots of time doing maintenance, it's time wasted. Look to automate these things.
So, as much as I say an analyst is by a person, and I do, because I strongly believe that analysis is done by a person, there is something to be said for taking away the really crappy tasks, and I've resisted this for like 5 or 6 years. There's something to be said for taking away the crappy little tasks that analysts have to do day in and day out every single time. My fear with automation has always been that they're going to try to use it to replace people, and then we're not going to get the instinct, because analysis is an instinct. It's a gut feeling. It's this concept of, like, this feels wrong. Anyway, next we move into AI and machine learning, and that's kind of a big one, too. And it's happening a lot in some of these tool suites. CrowdStrike's employing it. It's buzzwordy as hell, but everybody's talking now about AI and machine learning. But there's some cool stuff you can do with it if you really think about it from a project. So, like, data exfiltration. Wicked difficult to really catch. But when you start adding some machine learning algorithms into exfiltration and NetFlow data and what that looks like, you can do some kind of really cool stuff with it. And I've seen some really cool stuff done with that. So, as buzzwordy as it can be, and maybe it's not where everybody promises that it is, it does do some cool stuff. You got anything to add there?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I don't do machine learning.
Behavioral analytics, that you know that.
Yes, that's definitely more in the lane. When you look at your users, you see where they're logging in, what times, after hours. Even in certain environments where folks typically log on certain systems, now they're logging on different systems and different types of commands they're doing. Look into that and try to figure out what they're trying to do and put that piece of puzzle together.
So, you know what I'm realizing as we kind of get towards the end of this? We have gotten through basically this whole thing and only said correlation engine like one time. That's amazing. We're pretty much wrapping up. We do want to take a chance to give a special thanks. I'd like to thank William, Josh, and Jeff, 3 people that I work with who proofread this slide deck and told me all the things that sucked so that I could fix them. You've got a couple.
Yeah, thanking Antoine and Craig, good mentors to me throughout my career, and my team at T-Rex.
And my team at Verizon Media, and most importantly, our spouses and children who put up with all of our shit and let us do these kinds of things. So, questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, gripes? Does everybody want to go home?
Closing ceremony.
Anything? All right.
Oh, no, we got one.
Hold on. We got a question. Had to be a machine learning.
Adversaries were able to successfully reverse game AI to
You're not wrong. And I think we're definitely going to see it. I will say one thing about my time in the consulting world. And there are a couple adversaries who are really, really good at what they do. Most of them are really, really lazy because it works. So they don't really have to be really, really good. They just have to send you a phishing email, and you'll click it. However, every time we make a technological advancement to find bad guys, we have to expect that they're going to make the same technological advancement to not let us find them. Anything else? Absolutely. So, talk about like MISP, which is a free threat intelligence platform. So if you manage on a threat intelligence platform like MISP or something of that nature, I believe most things like Splunk have apps. Otherwise, you can ingest out into like a Stix taxi file and then have your SIEM automatically pull it. The downside of ingesting into a file is you have to replace it every day, and it's not going to be near as real time in case you isolate out. Like, as you remove IOCs, you want to make that reflective as well. And it's really nice to be able to manage that in one place rather than going like, well, let me pull this out of Splunk and then let me pull this out of MISP. And no, ideally you want to have it integrated in such a way, even if that's sending it up to a damn S3 bucket and then having it pulled down. So that you're doing the whole list, not just additions, so that anything that's been phased out is also going too, because phasing out intel is an incredibly important part of using intel for detections. Anything else?